Think about how you would feel if you were sick. Not sick enough to die, like in Rome where sick people usually ended up as statistics, but sick enough that you decided to see a doctor. You get to his office for a meeting. He greets you with the serious tone of a man who has studied medicine for years, read Hippocrates and Galen, and learned from the Greek and Roman medical traditions. He charges real money for his knowledge and has a reputation to uphold. He wants you to talk about your symptoms. He looks at your breathing, your posture, and your color. He might be able to feel your pulse. He is doing everything a careful doctor would do. He then takes a cup of your urine, holds it up to the light, swirls it gently and smells it. Not right away. Not with the quick professional sniff of someone checking off an item on a list. He smells it like a sommelier smells wine before making a decision about the vintage. With care, on purpose, with the focused attention of a man whose clinical conclusion depends a lot on what his nose is about to tell him. Then he tells you what's wrong with you. I know it sounds bad, but before you write it off as things the ancients did out of ignorance and move on, I have to tell you something that really shocked me when I found it in my research. Believe it or not, he was right sometimes. And I know this might be confusing, so I'm going to ask you to subscribe to my channel so I can teach you Roman history in a way that hasn't been done before. Let's get back to the explanation now. He wasn't right in a figurative sense. He wasn't right in a vague, pre-scientific way. He was biochemically correct, and we can prove it. The conditions his diagnostic method found by smelling urine are the same ones that modern laboratory analysis finds through methods that he couldn't see, but that sent the same smell signal to his trained nose. How often was he correct? What did he smell? Why did it work when it did, and why did it fail so badly the rest of the time? And what did he do with the patient after he figured out what was wrong? Which is what I want you to be ready for before we get there. Those are the questions. Let's start with the system itself. The Roman medical tradition of diagnosing urine was not just a bunch of home remedies. It was a well-thought-out, written down and taught in schools clinical framework with its own logic and a documented way of doing things. And the methodology begins at a point that many medical histories tend to gloss over. Uroscopy is the practice of looking at urine to make a diagnosis. The Romans did not come up with it. Greek medicine had been working on it since at least the 5th century BC, and they got it from them. By the time Galen wrote in the 2nd century AD, uroscopy was a well-known clinical practice with a lot of books written about it, a standard way to do it, and a place in the standard medical curriculum. Galen wrote a lot about how to look at urine, not as a curiosity or an extra method, but as a main diagnostic tool that needed training, experience, and the kind of pattern recognition that only comes with years of clinical practice to be used correctly. He talked about certain traits to look for, certain changes that showed certain conditions, and certain mistakes that new practitioners often made when interpreting things. The last group of mistakes, the mistakes of the inexperienced, is especially interesting because it suggests that there was a right way to interpret something that an experienced practitioner could reach, and the mistakes of the novice could be compared to that. Galen was not saying that uroscopy was not reliable. He said that you needed to be an expert to do well. From a clinical methodology point of view, this is the same thing you would say about reading an ECG. The examination protocol included 5 main traits. Color was the first thing. Roman doctors had made a very detailed color classification system for urine with different shades of yellow, amber, red, brown, and black, each linked to a different medical condition. The color wheel of Roman diagnostic uroscopy was recorded with such accuracy that it seems to have come from real systematic observation over many years of clinical practice. Second came transparency. There were different types of urine: clear urine, cloudy urine, urine with visible sediment, and urine with floating particles. Each type was clinically classified and linked to a specific meaning. The presence and nature of sediment were deemed especially informative. A fine white sediment settling to the bottom of the container was different from a thick reddish sediment, which was different from sediment that was floating around in the liquid instead of settling. Third was consistency, urine that is thin and watery versus urine that is thick and sticky. The Romans were right to notice that the consistency of urine changed depending on how hydrated a person was and what disease they had. This change could be used to make a diagnosis. The smell was fourth, and it's the one that most people think of when they hear about Roman uroscopy. This is probably because it's the most obvious to modern sensibilities. The Romans had a detailed and written system for classifying urine smells. Sweet-smelling urine, which we might call slightly fruity, was linked to certain conditions. Urine that smelt bad showed that there were other people. The Romans used words that mean sharp or biting to describe urine that was high in ammonia. This type of urine had its own medical connections. Odorless urine, surprising but documented, was regarded as significant in particular contexts. Fifth was taste. Yes, taste. Roman doctors tasted their patients' urine as part of the diagnosis. The primary sources make it clear, and without any shame, that this is true. It wasn't common for all doctors to do this, but it wasn't seen as strange or out of the ordinary. It was a clinical method with known uses that men who had trained for years and thought of it as a professional tool used. I want to think about this for a moment because I think it's important to do it right. The Roman doctor who tasted urine wasn't doing something gross because he didn't have any other options. He was using the most sensitive sensor he could find to solve a diagnostic problem within the limits of his clinical framework. The human tongue can sense sugar levels that are important for some medical conditions. The nose can pick up on volatile compounds that are made when certain metabolic states are present. The eye can see changes in color, turbidity, and sediment patterns. The Roman doctor was using all of his senses to get as much information as he could from the sample. This is correct from a methodological point of view. He often used the wrong way to understand the information he gathered. But the way the data was collected, using every available sensor, gathering as much information as possible, and looking for patterns, is the basis of clinical diagnosis in any time period. Now let's see what he found when the method worked. Roman uroscopy produced accurate diagnoses more frequently than anticipated, with underlying reasons that are more intriguing than mere coincidence. Let's begin with the case that is most clearly documented and most clearly right. Diabetes mellitus, particularly the forms known as type 1 and type 2 diabetes, generates a distinctive sweet odor in urine. The mechanism is clear. When diabetes is not controlled, the body can't process glucose normally, and the extra glucose spills into the urine, making it sweet, which can be smelt and tasted. The condition also causes higher levels of ketone bodies, which give the urine and breath a fruity or acetone-like smell. This was recorded by Roman doctors. They talked about a condition that included extreme thirst, frequent urination, and urine that smelt sweet. They linked these three symptoms together as a known clinical syndrome. The term diabetes originates from the Greek word for siphon, signifying excessive urination, and the Roman medical tradition adopted and elaborated on the Greek characterization of the condition. They didn't know what diabetes was. They didn't know what insulin was, how glucose metabolism worked, or how to think of the pancreas as the right organ, but they did correctly identify the symptom cluster and the olfactory marker. And a modern clinician who reads their description of the condition without translation will recognize it. A Roman doctor who smelt sweet urine and asked his patient about how often they urinated and how thirsty they were, was, based on the evidence, making a clinically correct diagnosis. He was doing it for all the wrong reasons and using a theoretical framework that wouldn't hold up in a first-year biochemistry class. But the clinical observation was correct. The glucose in the urine made it smell sweet. His nose was picking up on a real biochemical signal. Roman doctors wrote down changes in the color and smell of urine that are typical of liver disease with a fair amount of accuracy. When the liver doesn't process biopigments like bilirubin and urobilinogen properly, they leak into the urine and cause the dark amber to brown color that Roman doctors called bilious conditions. It's true that the color has changed. The way they thought it worked was wrong. The clinical observation was accurate. Urinary tract infections cause cloudy urine that smells bad because of bacteria breaking down and white blood cells and bacteria being present in the urine. Roman doctors correctly diagnosed this presentation as a problem with the urinary organs and linked it to pain when urinating, which is correct. They also gave out treatments that were, in some cases, not completely useless. We'll talk about the treatments separately though, because they deserve their own time. Later stages of kidney disease cause urine to have a foamy quality, which Roman doctors linked to kidney problems. This happens when too much protein spills into the urine because the kidneys can't filter it properly. The foam is a real sign that you have proteinuria. A Roman doctor who saw it and thought that the patient's kidneys weren't working right was right in the broadest clinical sense. Roman doctors correctly linked dark, concentrated urine with a strong smell to not drinking enough fluids and getting sick from the heat. This happens when you are very dehydrated. This one doesn't need any complicated biochemistry. Concentrated urine looks and smells different from well-hydrated urine, and you can see how it relates to fluid status without knowing anything about how the kidneys work. Do you see a pattern? Because I want to say it out loud. In every instance where Roman uroscopy yielded an accurate clinical observation, the underlying mechanism was consistent. A particular disease state induced a specific biochemical alteration in urine composition, which in turn generated a distinct sensory signal, such as color, odor, turbidity, or foam, that a trained observer could identify and correlate with the clinical condition. The Roman doctor was right to use his senses to help him figure out what was wrong. He was wrong about what the signals meant, but the signals were there, and training his senses to recognize them and building a clinical vocabulary around them was a real scientific breakthrough that helped him diagnose some cases. There was a big issue, was that the theoretical framework he used to make sense of the signals went way beyond the cases where the signals were real, into areas where he was more sure of the method than it was actually useful for diagnosis. That's when the story gets a lot more interesting. The Roman medical tradition took uroscopy to places where it shouldn't have gone. One of them was figuring out if someone was pregnant. Roman doctors thought that urine could tell if a woman was pregnant, and they had special tests for it. One method, which is written about in the sources, was to mix the urine with wine and watch what happened. Another one involved watering a certain plant with urine and watching how it reacted. A third test looked at the color and texture of the urine, with the specific claim that pregnant urine looked different enough for a trained eye to tell. These tests don't work. Pregnancy causes hormonal changes, like the production of human chorionic gonadotropin, that do change the composition of urine in ways that modern pregnancy tests take advantage of. However, these changes are not something that people can see or hear. A pregnant woman's urine doesn't smell, look, taste, or act in ways that a person can easily tell apart. Roman doctors were sure they could tell. They couldn't. And the only times they correctly identified a pregnancy were when they were base rates. For example, if a woman asks about pregnancy and is already several weeks along, her physical symptoms may have given the doctor the real diagnostic information, and the urine test may have just been a fancy way to confirm what the doctor had already figured out from other evidence. Another extension was personality and character assessment. Some Roman medical authors posited that urine could disclose insights into an individual's temperament, including their predominant humor, constitutional type, and overall character disposition. This is uroscopy used in psychology, and it has about the same diagnostic value as uroscopy used in psychology, which is none at all. But it was written down, it was learned, it was seemingly executed with the same clinical rigor as the genuinely beneficial applications. The third area was predicting health in the future. The notion that analyzing the urine of a healthy individual could disclose information regarding diseases they have not yet manifested but are genetically predisposed to is an extension of the humoral framework that appears entirely rational within that context. If your humors are already leaning toward a certain imbalance, you should be able to see that imbalance in your urine before the disease has fully developed. This is wrong, but it is wrong in a way that makes sense based on the facts. At one point, the moon cycle was involved. Some Roman doctors said that looking at urine was more reliable at certain times of the lunar cycle than others. This is because the moon's effect on bodily fluids, a long-held belief in both Roman and Greek medicine, meant that the urine was more truthful about the body's condition when the moon was in certain positions. I don't have anything to say about this. I just tell it like it is. Some doctors thought that a doctor with enough experience could tell what was wrong with a patient just by looking at their urine, without having to see the patient in person, ask them questions, or have any information other than the sample in the cup. This led to a practice called uroscopy by proxy, where a patient would send a servant with a urine sample to the doctor's office, get a diagnosis and prescription by messenger, and never meet the doctor in person. Galen, who wasn't afraid to say what he thought about everything, looked down on this practice. He thought it was a scam. He wrote about doctors who did this with the specific annoyance of a man who knew that the method was being oversold to gullible patients by doctors who cared more about their fees than their clinical accuracy. This means that in the 2nd century AD, Rome already had the problem of doctors selling diagnostic technologies to patients who didn't know enough to question the claims, and the best doctor of the time was publicly complaining about it in writing. Some things really are timeless. But Galen didn't hate uroscopy itself. He hated uroscopy by proxy. He had faith in the method. He did it. He thought that the doctor needed to be there to look at the patient and put together the urine test results with everything else that happened during the visit. The urine was one piece of information. The error was to think of it as the only one. This is still methodologically correct, even if the specific data point wasn't as reliable as he thought it was, and it makes you wonder what happened after the diagnosis. The treatments that came after Roman urinary diagnosis are a story that needs to be told on its own. Roman medicine after a urinary diagnosis worked within the same humoral framework as the diagnosis itself. This meant that the treatment was meant to fix any humoral imbalance that the urine had shown. In practice, this led to a variety of interventions that were genuinely useful, actively harmful, or completely neutral but expensive. The distribution across these categories was roughly what you would expect from a medical system that was working empirically in some areas and theoretically in others. Changing one's diet was the main treatment for most conditions, and this is where Roman medicine was most often on solid ground. Roman medical thought had a strong link between diet and health. Galen's dietary advice was thorough, specific, and often in line with what modern nutritional science would call good advice, cutting back on meat for patients who are showing signs of kidney stress. Patients with dark, concentrated urine should drink more fluids. Patients with digestive issues that caused certain changes in their urine should stay away from fermented foods. In terms of mechanics, none of these were right. Galen's reasons for his dietary suggestions were wrong. but the suggestions were usually right. It was true that some eating habits were linked to some health outcomes, even though the theory that linked them was made up. The second main type of treatment was herbal preparations, and the picture is much more mixed here. Roman pharmacology included a lot of plant-based medicines that could have real effects on the body, like bioactive compounds, or none at all, like inert compounds. Some of these medicines were even dangerous. Modern pharmacology has shown that juniper berry preparations, which are used to treat urinary problems, really do have diuretic effects. In some cases, the Roman doctor who prescribed juniper to a patient with urinary symptoms was prescribing something that would have a measurable effect on the body. Not always the right effect for the problem, but an effect. Silphium, an extinct plant from North Africa, was so valued in Roman medicine that its overcollection led to its extinction. It was used to treat a wide range of conditions, including those diagnosed through urine tests. We can't study a plant that doesn't exist anymore, so we can't figure out what its real pharmacological properties are. Roman sources say it works for almost everything, which could mean that it really has a wide range of pharmacological effects, or that people were paying a lot of money for a plant and convincing themselves it worked. Maybe both. Roman doctors called certain illnesses bilious, which we now think of as liver disease and other things. Some of the medicines they used to treat these illnesses had compounds that really protected the liver. Roman herbal medicine used milk thistle, which has silymarin in it. Silymarin is a real compound that protects liver cells and is still used in modern hepatology. The Roman doctor, who gave a patient with liver disease milk thistle-containing preparations, did so by accident, but they worked in a way that made sense. He didn't know this. He didn't give it to him because of the silymarin. He gave it to her because it fit the humoral theory of what she needed. The fact that it also contained a real pharmacologically active compound was a coincidence that his theoretical framework couldn't see as important. This is the pattern that Roman medicine follows over and over again. The uroscopian treatment pipeline shows it best. Wrong theory, empirical observation, sometimes right outcome, and no way to tell which cases had a real outcome and which had a placebo or chance outcome. Because there were no controlled trials, which are the specific methodological tool that would have let Rome tell the difference between signal and noise in its clinical outcomes. The medical tradition ended up with real discoveries and complete nonsense, with no reliable way to tell them apart. Galen, no matter how smart he was, couldn't figure this out. He could see. He could come up with ideas. He could tell that some practitioners were frauds and that some methods worked better than others. He didn't have the right ideas to design a study that would have told him why. In other words, the Roman doctor who smelt your urine, told you what was wrong with you, gave you a herbal remedy, and sent you home was really unsure of what was going on. But he hid that from you and from himself. There were times when the diagnosis was right, the treatment worked. Sometimes he couldn't always tell what time it was. Does this sound familiar? It should. The history of medicine is largely characterized by practitioners navigating genuine uncertainty while exhibiting clinical confidence, gradually advancing tools to differentiate effective treatments from ineffective ones. Rome was an early part of that history. Very early. But it was there. Roman doctors had a social status that was truly strange for Romans. Greeks, especially educated Greek men who had trained in the Hippocratic and later Galenic tradition, practiced medicine in Rome. They had studied in Alexandria, Pergamon, or other centers of Greek medical education, and then moved to Rome because it was where the wealthy patients were, and wealthy patients paid well. These men were smart. They were good at what they did for their time. In some cases, they were truly brilliant. For 14 centuries, Galen's work in anatomy and physiology was the most important source of information. even though it had some mistakes. The wealthy families that hired them and the rest of the Roman people who needed their services couldn't do without them. And they were of low social status in Roman society, not infamy, which meant they weren't legally degraded like gladiators, actors, or waste contractors were. But they weren't respected like a Roman senator or even a successful merchant was. Being a doctor was a job. It was not dignified to have to work with other people's bodies. It required the specific humiliations of uroscopy, which were not dignified. Greeks did it a lot, and Romans had mixed feelings about Greeks. They admired Greek intellectual culture, but also thought Greeks were better at thinking than at the more important Roman virtues of military command and governance. Cato the Elder, who had mixed feelings about most things, said that Greek doctors would be the end of Rome. He meant that depending on foreign experts for important services was both bad for culture and dangerous. He told the Romans to use traditional remedies, mostly cabbage, which Cato thought could cure almost anything, but really couldn't. But at least it was Roman and not Greek. The irony is very funny. Cato's distrust of Greek medicine and insistence on traditional Roman self-treatment likely resulted in more Roman fatalities than the Greek physicians he doubted. But his position was powerful, and the Romans' mixed feelings about professional medicine, both relying on it and looking down on its practitioners, lasted throughout the imperial period. Galen, the best doctor of the ancient world, spent a lot of time managing the politics of the Roman medical establishment, defending his methods against other doctors, working his way through the patronage networks that decided whose medical opinion was taken seriously by those who could pay for it, and sometimes putting on dramatic public displays of his diagnostic skill to build his reputation against other doctors. In other words, he was doing the same things that professionals in every field do to get ahead in a competitive market, building a good reputation, dealing with competitors, performing in front of others, and writing a lot to show that he was smart. It was Roman. The dynamics were the same for everyone. And the urine test was often at the center of those protests. Uroscopy was the most visually impressive part of the Roman clinical encounter. The doctor picked up the cup, held it up to the light, smelt it with professional focus, and pronounced it. Impressive visual moments are how you build a reputation in any time when there aren't many other ways to show clinical authority. Galen was a very talented showman, among other things. The urine test was part of the act, and the show did have some substance, which is what made it work and what made him so mad at the people who copied the form without understanding it. So, let's move on to the last question, the one that this whole video, and in some ways this whole series, has been leading up to. After I finished my research, I couldn't stop thinking about this one thing about Roman uroscopy. The Roman doctor who smelt your pee and told you what was wrong with you was not an idiot. He wasn't stupid in the way that people who don't know anything are. He was a trained professional, working within the best theoretical framework of his time, using the best diagnostic tools available. Sometimes he got things right, and sometimes he got things wrong. But there was no reliable way to tell which was which. And the one thing he didn't have that would have helped him tell the difference between his real diagnostic signal and his theoretical noise wasn't intelligence. It wasn't hard work. It wasn't even learning. It was a methodical tool that would not be made for another 15 centuries. The regulated trial, the methodical evaluation of results between treated and untreated cohorts, the particular intellectual technology that enables medicine to ascertain its knowledge rather than merely accept its beliefs. Without that tool, the Roman doctor was doing what all doctors do without it, gaining experience, learning to recognize patterns, becoming more sure of his conclusions, and not being able to tell when his confidence was justified and when it wasn't. This makes me feel small. not about Rome, but about us. The specific domains of contemporary medicine where controlled trial methodology is deficient, lacking, or challenging to implement are the same domains where current practitioners are engaging in activities structurally analogous to those of Galen, learning to recognize patterns, building trust in the clinic, getting results that are sometimes right and sometimes wrong, but not having reliable ways to tell which is which. The tools are better. The knowledge base is much better. There are fewer mistakes. But the way the problem is set up, an expert practitioner, incomplete information, a confident diagnosis, and an uncertain outcome is not unique to Rome. It is the permanent state of medicine, which gets better over time as each era comes up with new ways to do things. Rome played a role in that improvement, but not on purpose. The observations made by its physicians, those that were accurate and withstood subsequent examination, contributed to the empirical record upon which future medicine was developed. The sweet urine from diabetics was recorded in Rome. It was recorded again in the Arab medical tradition, which kept Greek medicine alive and well after the fall of Rome. It was recorded again in European medicine in the early modern period. And finally, when biochemistry came up with the tools to explain how it worked, the observation that had been building up for 1500 years finally had a correct theoretical explanation. You can still find Galen's cold cream in drugstores. Every medical school has a class on how to look at diabetic urine, but they all teach it in a different way. The patterns of organ-specific disease that Roman doctors found by looking at color and smell are the same patterns that modern urinalysis finds by using spectroscopy and chemical reagent strips. The observation lasted. The method changed over time. Even though the interpretation was wrong, the signal was real. The Roman doctor who picked up your cup, smelt it carefully, and told you something about your body was doing something that was both primitive and right in its goal. He was trying to figure out how your body was working by looking at the information it was sending out into the world. He was right that the information was available. He didn't have the right tools to get it out and understand it. We were too, until recently. So are we still in some ways. That is not a pleasant thing to see. It is right. And, as I said before, accuracy is more important than comfort, even when it smells bad. Now, I want to tell you something, and I want you to take it as seriously as a Roman doctor would if he told you that your urine smells like a disease he has a cure for. You have been watching a video for about 20 minutes about how doctors used to smell urine in Roman times. This is the Rome that you won't see on regular history channels. As you know, I'm going to keep looking into a whole civilization that was built on things that historians would rather not talk about. You obviously can't stop watching this, and that's why you should subscribe to my channel. Not because I'm being nice, not because it helps the algorithm, which it does, but that's not the point. This is just the beginning. A lot more. There are enough things in Rome's history that official records didn't mention to fill several more years of videos. We're going to talk about all of them in the same detail and with the same willingness to follow the evidence wherever it takes us, even if it takes us to a shady place. Sign up. If you want to get notifications, click the bell. The next video won't be announced like a Roman doctor would announce a diagnosis, with ceremony, seriousness, and a raised glass. It will just show up out of nowhere, and you can either watch it or not. The Romans who stayed in Rome did so because they didn't want to go anywhere else. If you don't subscribe, you'll miss out on what's next. I'll let you decide how much risk you're willing to take. See you in the next great story.